As I mentioned a few weeks ago, I was fortunate enough to go to a silent retreat at a monastery way out in Quebec, Canada this past week. I went up with a friend of mine, which is special because this is the first time that I've done this silent retreat with somebody else. And we were able to share our thoughts, the epiphanies, learnings on our drive back. We both read a good amount of books. We reflected, wrote, meditated, prayed, walked, smiled, listened to beautiful chantings by the monk, never once speaking to each other, except for when I asked him if he wanted tea. There was something I learned during my time there, which I wanted to share. And it's how I broke my silence during my silent retreat and why I ended up breaking it. And then we'll jump into the book, The Wisdom of the Desert by Thomas Merton. As I've recommended before, it's important that you should implement some form of silence in your life. A silent retreat or silent days in your year. And it doesn't have to involve going to a Benedictine monastery in Quebec. It could be at an Airbnb, a day in the park by yourself, alone, or in the woods somewhere camping. Because it is in our solitude, at least for me, in my solitude, that my mind's eyes becomes clear. And I can connect the dots, and I can see the long thread of my life and see how everything is connected, and allows me to reevaluate some of the things that I may not have had time to consider, think about, and think through. And more importantly, I take the silent retreat to contemplate on life, on meaning, on bliss, on existence, on love, on the infinite. And it is, in a very real sense, much easier to do this, I have found, by being at this Benedictine monastery when the whole Benedictine order is around a vow of silence. When the environment is built around silence, everything is much quieter, you're less distracted, and that is what I found. I read a bunch of books while I was there, and a lot of these books, not by design on my end, but a lot of these books were around love, were around the importance of human connection and how that can be pivotal in our lives, and how often a small chance encounter can be worth the quote-unquote distraction. So as I was reflecting on this, I was walking up and down the hallway, right? Thinking about how I could implement this better into my own life. There was an elderly woman in the corner reading a book while I was walking up and down. And as I was walking up towards the main door, she was about to step out. And these doors are very large and very heavy. So I held the door open for this elderly woman, who I later found out was 91. And as we both were stepping out of the building, she turned to me and asked my name. And this caught me by surprise because, one, I was doing a silent retreat, so I was not expecting to speak to anyone. And because I wasn't expecting to speak to anyone, I was standing there like a fool in total silence, almost forgetting my own name, because within me I was panicking. I was battling as to whether I should speak, whether I should not say my name. It all sounds a little silly when I talk about it. But eventually I said my name, and I'll call her B, because that's the first letter of her name. And she began asking me where I was from and what I was doing here. And I sensed that it would be my ego, my pride, if I refused to engage in conversation with her. Because in that moment when she asked my name, I considered not telling her my name and just nodding because I didn't want to speak. And at that moment I realized if I went about not sharing and not engaging in this conversation, I would have defeated the purpose of the silent retreat. Because the point of the silent retreat was to contemplate on life, on meaning, on bliss, on existence, on connection, on love. And here, before me, was this perfect opportunity to put into practice what I'd been reflecting on. And had I not spoken and had I kept my silence, it would only be serving my ego, right? My pride, my selfness. And so we began to converse, and the conversation was beautiful. We spoke about meaning, life, death, about the grass, about the flowers, about memories, about how old she was, her life, and how she lost her husband years ago, the afterlife, seeing beauty in the mundane things, in the insignificant moments of our life, and how many of us hold onto the destructive thought that we are separate, that we are other than each other. We spoke about religion and technology, In that conversation, I saw life through her eyes. All the things that I was reflecting on that past day and the day before came alive. And she talked about how the older you get and the closer you are to the end of this life, more clearly you see what the most important things in this life. I think B and I spoke for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And then we parted ways and I continued my walk. I've walked more in these past 4 days than I've walked in a very long time. My feet feel sore, my calf muscles are sore, my hips are sore, but it's a good kind of soreness. Then early next morning, I woke up, got ready, and walked around the Abbey. I didn't go outside because it was raining, so I was walking up and down the main corridor. Around the 1 hour, maybe 2 hour mark of walking around, waiting for breakfast. There's about 40 minutes until breakfast. A woman in her 40s, whom I had met during my conversation with B, was walking towards the chapel, and I was walking away from the chapel. And we met in the middle, and she asked if I was planning on walking outside. And I had mentioned that it was raining, and she said the rain had stopped. She asked if I'd like to walk together. And the same thought entered my mind. Should I say no because I'm on the silent retreat, and I can say at the end of the retreat that I was silent the whole time, or at least since my conversation with B? Or is this precisely the reason why I'm here? That if such moments arise, I can see it clearly without the fog, without the ego, without my pride getting in the way. I was laughing inside, thinking how foolish it would be to say, no, I don't want to go on this walk. So we went on this walk, and I'll call her C. That's the first letter of her name. And C was embarking on a new journey, one that she had never expected. Her outlook and understanding were shifting, and she had done marvelous things to help young girls become more confident, overcome challenges. But now the work that she was doing, she could no longer do. And she was in the middle of her life, as I mentioned, probably in her 40s, whereas B was at the end of her life. And C and I on our walk talked about children, love, our ego, our inability as a society to practice leisure, the vanity of all of this, of the things that we oftentimes think are important that turn out to be completely insignificant when death comes around, and how the insignificant moments that almost always end up becoming the most precious thing when we consider what life is all about. I was deeply moved by both C and B in their honesty, in the way that they were wrestling with the questions that they had. And I found that I learned as much talking to C and B as I did having read 6 books these past few days. And perhaps I'll see them again in the future, perhaps I won't. But I'm very grateful that I was able to have these conversations with these 2 people during my time there. And that is how I broke my silence at this retreat. And as I've been reflecting on these conversations, I was thinking about, following the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, and how I was, a split second or more than a split second, I was so bent on following the letter of the law that I considered not speaking and not engaging in conversation. When I look back, it would have been quite foolish, and I would have probably regretted not going on this walk and not sitting down and talking to B. So my silent retreat was silent for the most part, except for 4 to 5 hours of it. And I am very grateful for those 4 to 5 hours that I was able to have this conversation. And this is, I think, a great spot to jump into The Wisdom of the Desert by Thomas Merton, because these early ascetics spent their time alone in the unforgiving deserts of Egypt, praying and meditating. And when people would ask them how they should live their life, the desert monks often told them that they should just love, to love God and to love their neighbor. And it sounded too simple for some people, but for many others, they understood completely what the desert fathers were trying to say. Let's get into it. The flight of these men to the desert was neither purely negative nor purely individualistic. They were not rebels against society. True, they were in a certain sense anarchists, and it will do no harm to think of them in that light. They were men who did not believe in letting themselves be passively guided and ruled by a decadent state, and who believed that there was a way of getting along without slavish dependence on accepted conventional values. They did not intend to place themselves above society. They did not reject society with proud contempt, as if they were superior to other men. On the contrary, one of the reasons why they fled from the world of men was that in the world of men were divided into those who were successful and imposed their will on others, and those who had to give in and be imposed upon. The Desert Fathers declined to be ruled by men, but had no desire to rule over others themselves, nor did they fly from human fellowship. The very fact that they uttered these words of advice to one another is proof that they were eminently social. The society they sought was one where all men were truly equal, where the only authority under God was the charismatic authority of wisdom, experience, and love. This was the introduction to The Wisdom of the Desert by Thomas Merton. As you can tell, just based on that excerpt, if you have studied other religious ascetic practices, you will see the similarities between the desert ascetics of Christianity and of the Buddhists and of the Hindus and the Taoists. So Thomas Merton compiled The Wisdom of the Desert from the Verba Seniorum, which just means a saying of the elders. In this book contains aphorisms, advice, dialogues, and stories of the experiences of these early Christian hermits living in the Egyptian desert. And Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. He was also a mystic, a poet, a social activist, very influential during the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even up until very recently. Many of his close friends were Buddhists, Hindus, Taoists. He didn't really discriminate between different religious traditions, even though he himself was a Trappist monk within the Catholic tradition. He had a deep understanding of Eastern philosophy and mysticism, which later on gets him in trouble a bit in hot waters with other people who were more orthodox and more traditional. Merton was dedicated to understanding ultimate reality, life, of meaning, of love. His autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, is one that I have here with me, and it's one that I'll do soon. Just a paragraph down from that excerpt, Merton goes on to say, "What the fathers sought most of all was their own true self, and in order to do this they had to reject completely the false, formal self, fabricated under social compulsion in the world. These desert fathers understood that to find themselves, to know themselves, they must kill the ego. They must humble themselves, know themselves, and that's something we'll get into." Now, Merton says, all through the Verba Seniorum, we find a repeated insistence on the primacy of love over everything else in the spiritual life, over knowledge, gnosis, asceticism, contemplation, solitude, prayer. Love, in fact, is the spiritual life, and without it, all the other exercises of the spirit, however lofty, are emptied of content and become mere illusions. The more lofty they are, the more dangerous the illusion. It reminds me of a quote by Thomas Aquinas when he says, "To love God is more excellent than to know Him." There is nothing greater than love. And these desert monks understood it. These hermits, though oftentimes they lived by themselves, they understood the importance of it. They understood that even if you comprehend the mysteries of the universe, seen the face of God, speak words of wisdom, if you do not have love, you are an empty vessel. You are merely living in illusion. Everything that you say is emptied of content. You're like a bowl with no water, offering people this bowl to quench their thirst, but there's nothing in there. And to love in this transcendental sense in which the hermits are talking about, you had to let go of your ego. You had to remove that ego. And as Merton writes, he could not dare risk attachment to his own ego or the dangerous ecstasy of the self-will. He could not retain the slightest identification with his superficial, transient, constructed self. He had to lose himself in the inner, hidden reality of a self that was transcendent, mysterious, half-known, and lost in Christ. The greatest enemy to understanding, the greatest enemy to knowing yourself, the greatest enemy to love is pride. It is what prevents man from knowing himself and consequently knowing the truth. And Merton goes on to write, these fathers distilled for themselves a very practical and unassuming wisdom that is at once primitive and timeless, and which enabled us to reopen the resources that have been polluted or blocked up altogether by the accumulated mental and spiritual refuse of our technological barbarism. These hermits practiced solitude because they believed that this was the only way they could save the world, right? By sacrificing themselves, by cutting themselves off from all the pleasures of this world. Some of them were more extreme than others. There are stories of how certain hermits would build walls around themselves or build a wall around their cave so nobody could come in, or others who would build these towers where there was no stairs going up, but they just built a tower where they could just stay there so that people wouldn't disturb them. There was one particular quote in here that stuck with me when I read it. It's a powerful quote, and Merton writes, what can we gain by sailing to the moon if we are not able to cross the abyss that separates us from ourselves? This is the most important of all voyages of discovery, and without it, all the rest are not only useless, but disastrous. This illusion that we are separate, different, other, is the result of our failing to know each other. And that is what Merton's getting at, and that's what the fathers are getting at. We do everything to avoid exploring the depths of our soul because we are afraid of the unknown. We are afraid to go from known to unknown. For in the journey towards the self, there is ambiguity, and we hate ambiguity in our lives. And sometimes we laugh at people when they seem to be confused, because we know what it's like to be confused. We know what it's like to be lost. We know what it's like to exist in that ambiguity. And we laugh because we feel that we are in a place of security. But to know yourself, you must go from secure to insecure. And that journey is more terrifying to people than traveling across the sea to find new land. We rather do anything but look within ourselves and know ourselves. And Merton goes on in the same paragraph to say, proof, the great travelers and colonizers of the Renaissance were, for the most part, men who perhaps were capable of the things they did precisely because they were alienated from themselves. In subjugating primitive worlds, they only imposed on them, with the force of cannons, their own confusion and their own alienation. When you cross the abyss that separates you from yourself, you realize that you and I are not really that different. In fact, you are very much in myself or me, and I am in a very real sense you. And this disintegrates the barriers and the walls, fences that we put up that makes us hate each other for the way we look, for the things that we believe in, for the things that we eat. But once you have crossed the abyss, you realize all of this hatred that we have for each other is a misunderstanding. And not only a misunderstanding, is it an illusion. Because in hating the other, we are only hating ourselves. In the episode on Krishnamurti's You Are the World, he says precisely this. He says, we go to war, we kill each other, we hate each other because we do not know ourselves, because we fail to realize that the person we are killing, that the person we are hating, that the nation we are bombing, we are doing that to ourselves, and we are only harming ourselves. And that is the greatest tragedy in our history. Merton writes, if these men say little about God, it is because they know that when one has been somewhere close to his dwelling, silence makes more sense than a lot of words. Silence is where you hear God. Many, however, often seek God in the noise, in the temple, in the loud chantings, but God is only found in the utter silence of your soul. Now, when I say God, it probably conjures up certain images, concepts in your mind. Perhaps in your mind you think of an old wise man in the sky with long drapery clothing, with a scepter in his hand, similar to the Greek gods or some of the Hindu avatars. Or perhaps you think God is like a infinitely powerful human king or prime minister type who rules over the cosmos, who has these moral codes that one must follow, otherwise you're banished into hell. And he gives us divine codes of life of how you must follow everything by the letter of the law. Or you might think that God is like a watchmaker who creates this cosmos and then leaves it all to function by itself. But when I say God, I don't mean any of those things. When I say God, what I'm referring to is ultimate reality, the eternal force, that which is Satchit Ananda, existence itself, pure actuality, the eternal ultimate self. God is in all things, beyond all things. God is in you and in me. This is why I think Namaste is such a beautiful way of greeting somebody. It means I bow to the divine in you, or the sacred in me recognizes the sacred in you. And for these desert fathers, this was true in that Christ died for all, and so Christ was in me just as Christ is in you. And so then it becomes crucially important that I love you just as much as I love myself. But I can only love myself if I understand and know myself. Now, getting into the actual stories of these desert hermits, and I quote, Abbot Pambo questioned Abbot Anthony, saying, "What ought I to do?" And the elder, referring to Anthony, replied, "Have no confidence in your own virtuousness. Do not worry about a thing once it has been done. Control your tongue and your belly." Anthony here is telling Pambo, don't be filled with pride. So long as you are inhabiting this flesh and bone, have no confidence in your virtuousness. Only guard your tongue and your belly. So why your tongue? Your tongue, Anthony realizes, is one of the most powerful things. It's a small piece of muscle, has the power to love, speak words of wisdom, words of love, but also it has propensity to hatred, towards fear. Your tongue can incite a war. And so Abbot Anthony here tells Pambo, control your tongue. And then he says, control your belly. And your belly, because your belly houses your most persistent desire, hunger. It always wants to eat because your body needs nourishment, because we are in this body made of flesh and bones. And Anthony realizes that if you do not control your belly, it then becomes an indication of whether you have control over yourself. If you're a glutton when it comes to food, then very likely you have an inability to control yourself, your inability to control your anger, your inability to control your vices. Like so many of these desert fathers' advice, they're able to boil down virtues and how to practice them in such a practical way. Control your tongue and your belly. Another story is of Abbot Macarius, who was on his way home carrying reeds, and the devil meets him with a reaper's sickle in his path. And the devil tried to get him with the sickle, but couldn't. And he said to Abbot Macarius, "I suffer great violence from you, Macarius, because I cannot overcome you. For see, I do all the things that you do. You fast, I eat nothing. You watch, and I never sleep. But there is one thing which you overcome me." Abbot Macarius said to him, "What is that?" And the devil replies, "Your humility, for because of it I cannot overcome you." I had come across this story a while ago. I read it, and so I was glad to find it in here, because I couldn't remember what the actual story was. I just remembered that the devil had said, "Your humility is what I couldn't overcome." The moral of the story here is that humility is the key to gaining wisdom and to peering into the eternal and to knowing yourself. The Desert Fathers are insistent on practicing humility. Lao Tzu and Confucius also both talk about the importance of humility, and so too does Solomon in Proverbs. And in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, only when Arjuna humbles himself does Krishna reveal his true form, that he is Vishnu, who is the ultimate reality, that which is part of the Trimurti. And Krishna says to Arjuna, and I quote, "This form you have seen is rarely revealed. The gods are constantly craving for a vision of this form. Not through sacred lore, penance, charity, or sacrificial rites can I be seen in the form that you saw me. By devotion alone can I, as I really am, be known and seen and entered into, Arjuna." And what Krishna means by devotion alone can I be seen is when Arjuna has humbled himself and killed his ego, that Krishna was able to reveal himself in his true form as Vishnu. And I quote another story. A brother asked one of the elders, "What is humility?" The elder answered him, to do good to those who do evil to you. The brother asked, "Supposing a man cannot go that far, what should he do?" The elder replied, "Let him get away from them and keep his mouth shut." The elder's point is, if you can't learn humility, then shut your mouth, for this will teach you humility. And get away from them as far as possible without wanting to seek revenge, because that also will teach you humility. And you can tell where the desert hermits are getting their understanding of humility from, which is Jesus when he says, turn the other cheek. When Jesus says, do not repay evil for evil, this is what the fathers are getting at here in these stories. And one of the funny stories in here is of Abbot Anthony. And Anthony is the father of the desert hermits. Like, he is the guy who started it all. And Anthony was asked by somebody why he doesn't read at all and how he's able to learn all these things and have all this wisdom. And Anthony replies, whenever I want to read, I step outside of my cave and I read the book of nature, which is all that before me. This reveals two things. One is that they spend most of their time in contemplation versus reading and engaging in dialogue with each other. And two, they often lived alone for most of the time, and they would get together for social events or for prayer or for what other conversations that they wanted to have. Solitude is very important for these desert hermits. As one elder says, apply yourself to silence, have no vain thoughts, and be intent in your meditation, whether you sit at prayer or whether you rise up to work in the fear of God. If you do these things, you will not have to fear the attacks of the evil one. Understand and realize that meditation, this elder is saying, is not a once or twice in a day activity, as many people want to believe. And for us specifically, it's not listening to guided meditation on an app or listening to the sound of bells or sitting in the chapel hearing Gregorian chants. These are things that you might do, but they are not the depth of meditation. What this particular elder here understood is that our whole life is supposed to be the meditation. Whether you're sitting in prayer or whether you're rising up, whether you're working, everything is the meditation. Everything is prayer. So a life properly lived is an act of meditation. It is one unified meditation. So from birth till death is one long meditation. And as we get older and older, we become better and better at meditating. Just as if you start off meditating for the first time today, it's very hard to sit still for maybe a minute for some people, maybe 2 minutes. But over time, you go from a short amount of time to a longer amount of time. But again, the length is not the point here. The point here is the more you practice, the deeper you are able to understand yourself and understand as a result the world around you. And on that point about death, there's a story of an elder in the Wisdom of the Desert, and he's dying, and his brothers are surrounding him and they're crying for him and they're weeping. He opens his eyes as he's dying, looks at them crying, and begins laughing. And then he closes his eyes again. And then opens it again and laughs at them and closes it again. And then the third time opens his eyes and begins laughing. And these brothers who are weeping and being sad by this elder who's about to die asks him why he's laughing at them. And the elder says, I laughed the first time because you fear death. I laughed the second time because you are not ready for death. And the third time I laughed because from laborers I go to my rest. And in a very real sense, this elder who's dying in the desert is speaking to us in our fear of death and our unpreparedness for death. But truly, as this elder realized in his laughter, what is there to be afraid of? Are you afraid that all the things that you are doing are meaningless? And that if you're honest with yourself, you might realize that you have not done anything that you truly wanted to do, or that you've not drunk deeply from the waters of life, or that you've never tasted the sweetness of true love? Is that what you're afraid of? That when you die, you would have never experienced any of these things? Or are you afraid that you'll lose your identity, your selfness? That all this image you've shaped by your sheer will, by your sheer power, will be gone in a moment when you die? And then, who would you be? Without the fame, without the status, who are you when all this is gone? What are you if you aren't your ego? Sometimes I laugh when I think about death because it's such a silly thing that we are afraid of. Because when death comes, we rest. As Balthazar Garcian says, the whole point of philosophy is to prepare ourselves for death. Make death your friend, as this elder made death his friend. There's a story of Abbot John the Dwarf, who had prayed that God take away all his passions so that he would become impassible, that he would no longer have any struggles. And when he told Abbot Pastor about this, Abbot Pastor says to John the Dwarf, "Go and pray to the Lord to command some struggle to be stirred up in you, for the soul is matured only in battles." And when the temptations started up again for John the Dwarf, he did not pray that the struggles be taken away from him, but only said, "Lord, give me strength to get through this fight." So too, with our struggles and our challenges, we shouldn't seek to cast this off, and we shouldn't pray, and we shouldn't want these struggles to be removed from our lives, because as Abbot Pastor said, the soul is matured only in battle. And we see these struggles and challenges as a way to grow, increase in our love, as a way to embody our virtuous principles in trying times, because you don't really know what you believe in until you have to struggle against it, until you have to struggle to embody the principles that you say you believe in. It doesn't mean we should be sadistic and seek out struggles and suffering, but when it happens to you, which inevitably it will happen to you, do not seek and pray for the struggles and challenges to be rid of. Instead, be like Abbot John the Dwarf when he prays, "Lord, give me strength to get through the fight." And related to this, there's another story with Abbot Pastor when he says, "There are two things which a monk ought to hate above all, for by hating them he can become free in the world." And the brother asked, "What are these things?" The older replied, "An easy life and vain glory." An easy life because there is no struggle in an easy life, and a vain glory because you are getting glory without having done any work, neither of which are good for the soul. There's another story where Abbot Agatha, I think that's how you say his name, is asked about bodily asceticism and about the interior man and which one's more important and which one you should practice and focus on more. And the abbot says, "A man is like a tree. His bodily works are like the leaves of the tree, but the interior, self-custody, is like the fruits. Since then it is written that every tree not bearing fruit shall be cut down and cast into the fire. We must take care to bear this fruit, which is custody of the mind. But we also need leaves to cover and adorn us, and that means good works done with the aid of the body." This Abbot Agatha was wise in understanding and tireless in his work and ready for everything. He applied himself energetically to manual labor and was sparing in his food and clothing. Now, two things at the end. He was sparing his food and clothing, very much related to what we talked about earlier, controlling their stomach. Right? And because he can control his stomach, he can control his other temptations and other desires. But on the point about which is more important, bodily asceticism or the interior man, Abbot Agatha says both are important to living a virtuous life. If you focus only on bodily asceticism, it will lead you down the path of pride and of vainglory and of not wanting to speak to somebody on your silent retreat because you wanted that glory of being able to say that I was on a silent retreat, never having spoken a word. And on the flip side of this, if you focus only on the interior man, it would lead you to a life of delusion, because you will bear fruit. However, these fruits will all shrivel up because of the heat of the sun. So then you realize that through contemplation, you understand that life is to be lived with others, in service of others. And if that is true, then you must go beyond yourself and reach the other. And this is like the tree with leaves. And this is why Abbot Agatha says a man is like a tree, should bear fruit and also have leaves to cover and adorn ourselves and protect the fruit that is growing from getting shriveled up by the heat of the sun. There's something that Abbot Moses says that reminded me of Krishnamurti, and I quote, "A certain brother went to Abbot Moses in Skadi and asked him for a good word. And the elder said to him, 'Go, sit in your cell, and your cell would teach you everything.'" By cell, he means wherever this hermit was living, not like not a prison cell. And it reminded me of Krishnamurti, because Murti insists that you don't need a teacher, right? You don't need somebody to tell you how to live, what to think. You can learn everything from within yourself, and that everything is already contained in you. And it is only a matter of knowing yourself that you will be able to understand and know the world. So Abbot Moses' advice to this brother is very much an advice for you too. To go sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. But embedded in this short sentence, go sit in your cell and your cell will teach you everything, contains the most important advice of all, and that is humility. It is only through humility that you'll be able to sit in silence in your cell, and through that silence and that humility, you'll be able to learn. And so then, for us, the mistake to avoid is to think that we don't actually need to learn anything from anybody else. Because if you have humility in your life, the first thing you'll realize is that you don't know anything. And if you don't know anything, then that requires that you learn from somebody. The last thing you want to do is speak in arrogance and act out in arrogance. So there's a story on this precisely. And it goes, a brother asked Abbot Theodore and began to question him and to inquire about things which he had never yet put into practice himself. The elder said to him, meaning Theodore, as yet you have not found a ship, and you have not put your baggage aboard, and you have not started to cross the sea. Can you talk as if you had already arrived in that city to which you plan to go? When you have put into practice the things you are talking about, then speak from knowledge of the thing itself. Theodore here is very clear. Practice what you preach. Do not speak out of arrogance. Do not speak out of vanity. Do not speak out of pride. Which I think can be very easy if you misunderstand Krishnamurti or you misunderstand Abbot Moses' advice here. And more importantly, to avoid the habit of abstract acquisition of knowledge for vanity's sake. So what if you can recite Shakespeare or write beautiful poems about the mysteries of the universe, or speak and read 7 ancient languages, and can read the Tao Te Ching in classical Chinese and read the Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit, but you don't learn to integrate these into your lives, and you don't have love, right? Then you are simply, as Abbot Theodore says here, you're like the man that Theodore speaks about. You're somebody who has not found the ship, has not even put their baggage on the ship, has not even begun crossing the ship, but you're talking as if you've done all these things. And as Abbot Theodore says, when you have put into practice the things you are talking about, then speak from knowledge of the thing itself. Interestingly enough, when I was at the monastery, I read a review of a book, and the book was about how reading Plato and some of the other great works had changed this author's life. And I chuckled at the end because the reviewer was saying something as if he was proud of it. He was asserting that he had read no book at all that had ever changed his life for good. And he was a professor of classics or a professor of literature. I forget one of those two. Even though he had read all of the great classics, claimed that none of them had affected his life. And not only that, he was proud and happy to simply be an appreciator of these works. I was reading this and shaking my head, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. The over-intellectual man is no different than the fool who refuses to learn. And this is a lesson to not be like this book reviewer who, in his over-intellectualization of all things, was happy to simply be an appreciator of these works and not have these works impact him or affect him in any way whatsoever. Abbot Pastor sums up what I want to say best and how I'm feeling and thinking when he says, if you have a chest full of clothing and leave it for a long time, the clothing will rot inside. It is the same with the thoughts in our hearts. If we do not carry them out by physical action, after a long while, they will spoil and turn bad. If we do not put into practice the things that we are reading, the things that we are speaking about, the things that we learn, these ideas will simply remain, these thoughts will simply remain inside of our heart, inside of our mind, and over time, they will rot away. They will harm you. And you'll simply be a chest with rotting clothes inside of you. There's a quote from Merton I wanted to read, and he writes, "It is hard to really love others if love is to be taken in the full sense of the word. Love demands a complete inner transformation, for without this we cannot possibly come to identify ourselves with our brothers. We have to become, in some sense, the person we love, and this involves a kind of death of our own being, our own self. No matter how hard we try, we resist this death. We fight back with anger, with recriminations, with demands, with ultimatums. We seek any convenient excuse to break off and give up this difficult task." And this is precisely what we were talking about earlier when it comes to knowing yourself. Because when you know yourself, you realize that you are really no different than the other person. And in that realization, there is a death that occurs. The death of the ego, the death of the selfness. And this is why Merton says, and this involves a kind of death of our own being, our own self. And why he says we have to become, in some sense, the person we love. You have to become the person we love and see that you and me are no different, that I am you and you are me. True love is dying to oneself only to be resurrected with the other. That, I think, is the most beautiful thing about love. So the challenge for this week is to practice humility. And that doesn't mean to be a doormat and let everyone walk over you and trample you. Right? Humility is acting in love, speaking in love. If somebody is mistreating you, instead of letting them just simply walk over you, you respond with love and with grace. And if they don't understand, so be it. You walk away. And humility also begins with understanding that you are finite. You're here for a slice of time. You're here not to grow your ego and your selfness, but to grow in love. And that means to forgive the other, as the Desert Fathers have been teaching us. And with that, I'll wrap. Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you've learned something from the Desert Hermits. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to do Thomas Merton's autobiography sometime in the next few weeks. Do share this episode and this podcast with your friends and with your family. And if you haven't already given a review on Apple, you can scroll down to the bottom of your Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star rating. And if you're listening to this on Spotify, you can click the 3 buttons beside follow, and there'll be a drop-down menu and they'll say rate the podcast, and then you can give this podcast a rating there. Until next week, peace.